The first cause of the decline of the Western Han Dynasty, and this will be true for the Eastern Han Dynasty that replaces it in time as well, is that they debased their coinage. Instead of continuing to mint coins with a steady amount of silver, where the value of the coin was backed up by the literal value of the precious metal, the emperors began to decrease the amount of silver in their coins. As they decreased the amount of silver in their coins, they could mint more coins and pay their immediate bills. The problem is that the currency took a hit over time. The value of the currency went down as the amount of silver in the coins went down. This resulted in inflation, which ultimately became out of control. As inflation goes up, the price of food, the price of armaments, the price of horses, the price of land, everything becomes intolerable ultimately, and that leads to rebellion. So you end up with a situation where the central government, because of its massive defense spending, is inflating its currency, destroying its economy as a result, and you have large private estates of very, very wealthy nobles who have thousands of so-called guests, which are really private soldiers and bodyguards, their own private armies, who are taxing their own domains, and the central government seeing none of that money. So the state is hard-pressed for funds, having to defend against an ever larger frontier. And you have these estates by feudal nobles who are effectively doing everything that they can to avoid paying the government any kind of tax. And on top of that, they're flouting the laws of the state and ruling their own fiefdoms as if they were their own mini empires. And of course, when a revolt breaks out, these fiefdoms their loyalty is always called into question. It would be these feudal warlords who would ultimately deal the final death blow to the Han Dynasty. However, they weren't the only cause of decline. You had massive environmental disasters as well, such as the flooding of the Yellow River that occurred in the first decade of the 1st century AD. This flooding was so intense that it actually caused the Yellow River to change course and change its position, coming out on the other side of the Shandong Peninsula, right? Which is the equivalent of, as I said in an earlier lecture, the Mississippi River shifting course from coming out at New Orleans to coming out in Mobile, Alabama. Absolutely devastating, absolutely destructive to very, very valuable farmland. And it was the responsibility of the state to ensure that this kind of flooding didn't happen. The state was the only power that could maintain the dikes, the irrigation systems, all of the flood control measures that kept people safe and kept the agricultural system working. When the state was in decline, when it was in a state of absolute corruption, nothing could be done. There was also the issue of eunuchs. Eunuchs play a major role in the downfall of dynasty after dynasty throughout traditional Chinese history. The various dynasties of China will fall time and time again, in part due to the negative contributions of eunuchs. Eunuchs were castrated male servants, usually castrated as young boys, and then sent by their impoverished families to serve in noble households, and ultimately the major prize, the imperial household. The reason for their existence is that you could not have intact men inside the interior palaces of noblemen and the emperor. The reason for this is that intact men could impregnate one of the emperor's concubines, and then the parentage of the future heir could be in question, which would lead to a civil war and the deaths of thousands or even millions of people. So it was paramount for the safety of the dynasty and for the safety of society that the parentage of the emperor's children never be called into question. And the only way to ensure that was that every man who was in the presence of the emperor had to be castrated. And so these eunuchs took care of the bodily needs of the emperor. They were his source of comfort. They dressed him. They poured his drinks. They provided him food. They would serve as his physicians. They would play different board games with him. They would play music with him. He would rely on the eunuchs for his own entertainment. And so the interior of the palace was a world dominated by eunuchs. In many instances, eunuchs could gain great influence at court as a result. If the emperor was considered relatively weak, if he was weak-minded, easily influenced, you could have situations where these eunuchs disregarded boundaries and actually attempted to govern parts of the empire, often in the form of their own self-interest. These were not men with children who were concerned with the long-term viability of the future state in the minds of Chinese historians. This is what they're saying. So, from the standpoint of traditional Chinese historians, eunuchs could be a very poisonous force in destroying governments. Because while the scholar officials are fighting to prevent famines, to have grain distributed among the people, to fight off the various barbarians who have broken through the parts of the Great Wall, or they're attempting to manage flood control systems, or otherwise alleviate an epidemic disease, the eunuchs are concerned with enriching themselves, with gathering luxuries and living high lives in the palace. They're not concerned with the outside world or with the prosperity of the provinces. And for many traditional Chinese historians like Sima Qian, whom I've discussed before, the eunuchs were a major source of decline. And in fact, they were, objectively speaking. The emperors who relied on eunuchs to administer the empire ended up paying a heavy penalty for that. Another source of decline in the Han Dynasty was the sheer number of women kept by the emperor. The emperor kept hundreds of concubines and often had several empresses, and competition between these women for status, for the emperor's attention, and for the succession of their children often resulted in violence. Sometimes the empresses would have each other's children poisoned. They would have each other poisoned. They would often involve others outside of the court in their conflicts. So you had scholar officials and eunuchs who would form alliances with these different empresses, and there would be intrigue between groups to place certain sons on the throne instead of others, and the result could often be violence. For example, towards the end of the Han Dynasty, the Grand Chancellor, He Jin, his sister was empress. Because his sister was in her prominent position, she got her brother appointed to the post of Grand Chancellor, and as a result, a man who was not up to the task was running the empire, and he allowed the apparatus of state to basically disintegrate. And of course, he himself was battling against a faction of eunuchs who in turn allied themselves with her, so there was this kind of three-way power struggle that was very destructive for the central government. When the Eastern Han Dynasty faced all of these difficulties, in time the prestige of the imperial throne became so weakened that a scholar official named Wang Mang was encouraged by both the scholar officials and the eunuchs to seize the throne and proclaim himself emperor. So in 9 AD, Wang Mang proclaimed the Xin Dynasty. We romanize that as Xin. The Xin Dynasty was very, very short-lived. Wang Mang himself was overthrown just 14 years later in 23 AD due to the fact that his reign was an abject disaster. Wang Mang rose to prominence because he was very filial. He took care of his aged uncle. He was considered morally upright. He was very well educated, very intelligent, and was a master of the Confucian classics. The problem was that he was also a very radical idealist. He attempted to restructure the economy and society according to unrealistic standards. One thing he attempted to institute is something called the well-field system, which was a kind of utopian system of land ownership in which you have 8 farming plots surrounding one common plot. the peasant families, you have 8 families who all work the outside plots, and each of their plots respective to their own families, and then the interior plot they all collectively work on, and that's what's given to the state. So this is kind of an idyllic arrangement of land ownership where there's complete equality, and on top of that, everyone's working together to provide for the needs of the state. The problem with that is that it's contrary to human nature. It's the opposite of the Wu-wei policy enacted during the rule of Wan and Jing, if you remember that. The well-filled policy required every family to work their own plot and also to work on part of the government plot. The problem was that people worked on their own family's plot and let the government plot follow. So the state ended up suffering due to a lack of funds. On top of this, many of the large-scale landowners resisted the redistribution of their property in this manner. So you have constant revolts, you have a massive flooding of the Yellow River. Wang Mang attempted to abolish slavery, which was something that would later be reinstated almost immediately after his fall. So, in fact, he was the first ruler in the history of the world to abolish slavery. So he was attempting to achieve too much too quickly, and the convulsions that resulted from his policies, his idealistic policies, led to his doom. He ended up actually fighting to the death against a rebellion, and after his death, a member of the Liu clan, the imperial Han Dynasty clan, the ruling clan, reestablished the Han Dynasty, and we call this period of the Han Dynasty the Eastern Han Dynasty. This is the 200-year period in which the capital is at Luoyang instead of Chang'an. So just like Rome, the Han Dynasty fell, but it was restored again after the usurper who destroyed the Han Dynasty was defeated. So Liu Shu, the Guangwu emperor, restored the Han Dynasty, the Han imperial family, to power after the defeat of Wang Mang, and he profited very much from some of what Wang Mang did. Wang Mang's attempt to break up these massive estates held by the nobility meant that there were less warlords challenging his authority. On top of this, the painful step of breaking up large estates and giving them to the peasants had already been achieved, so the Guangwu emperor didn't have to expend political capital on that issue. Instead, he attempted to secure the empire's borders, promote internal stability, and revive the system of official examination, removing the nobles from government positions and promoting scholar officials as Wu Di had done. And he was able to restore the dynasty effectively enough that it would not fall until the 220s AD. While the Eastern Han Dynasty would last until 220 AD, the decline began several decades earlier. In the 170s and 180s, you had 2 weak emperors, the last of which, Emperor Ling, presided over a large-scale rebellion during a period of eunuch domination. While the eunuchs controlled the imperial court, had the ear of the emperor, and essentially turned the government into their own private bribery factory, an epidemic disease raged throughout the provinces, and a kind of mystical Taoist holy man who had originally been a scholar who had failed the national examinations, named Zhang Jue, ends up creating a cult called the Yellow Scarves, or Yellow Turbans. Zhang Jue claimed that he could cure this disease, which we now think may have actually been bubonic plague, that was ravaging the Chinese population. Apparently, his cure was effective enough that thousands upon thousands of peasants rallied to his cause. Zhang Jue claimed that the age of the Han was over and a new yellow era was beginning, in which heaven and earth would become one, and he would rule both as the supreme emperor chosen by heaven. So it was an apocalyptic, kind of what we would call a millenarian cult with different religious rituals and different moral teachings. With this cult rampaging throughout several provinces, the imperial court was essentially paralyzed due to the fact that it was largely run by two competing factions. One, the eunuchs, a group of eunuchs led by a eunuch named Zhongrong. They were called the Gang of 12, 12 very powerful eunuchs who basically were more concerned about protecting their own power than anything to do with the provinces, and they were very wary of the imperial government becoming strong enough to defeat the rebels. The other faction was the Empress Ha and her followers, who were mostly the court officials, particularly the Grand Chancellor Ha Jin, so who was her brother. So you end up with a situation where the central government can't respond to the rebellion. The end result was that the rebels were crushed, but by warlords out in the provinces. And these warlords grew in power as a result of this conflict. Even though the rebellion was crushed, it was pretty much the death nail to the Han Dynasty due to the fact that the warlords had gained power and the central government had lost the bulk of its power. What follows is a 30-year period in which warlords fight each other while there is still a Han emperor at the capital, technically reigning, but with no control out in the countryside, and the majority of the population will perish in these 3 decades of fighting. This period will be followed by a period in which the emperor abdicates, and the empire is replaced by 3 warring kingdoms who will fight each other into a state of ruin. You have Wei in the north, Wu in the south, and Shu in the southwest. And the struggle between these 3 kingdoms is one of the most epic, destructive struggles in Chinese history, and it's probably the most celebrated period of Chinese history in terms of drama, the arts, but for the people living in this period of time, it's absolutely horrific, with the majority of the population dying, as I stated earlier.